The desert stretched endlessly before Ayanna, her moccasined feet leaving barely a whisper against the hard-pan earth. 3 days had passed since the Council of Elders pronounced their judgment, their weathered faces carved from stone as they spoke the words that severed her from everything she had ever known. The Apache woman pulled her worn blanket tighter around her shoulders, though it offered little protection against the shame that burned hotter than the merciless sun overhead. Her crime had been simple, yet unforgivable in the eyes of her people. She had looked, truly looked, into the blue eyes of a white settler at the trading post near Fort Apache, not with hatred or fear, as was expected, but with something far more dangerous: curiosity. The moment had lasted no more than a heartbeat, but it had been witnessed by her cousin, who carried the tale back to the reservation like a poisonous seed. Before I continue with this incredible story of forbidden love and redemption in the Wild West, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying these tales of the frontier. Also, I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. Now, Ayanna walked the path of the exiled, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of her ancestors' disappointment. The elders had stripped her of her name within the tribe, declaring her dead to her people. Her mother had wept silently, forbidden to speak her daughter's name again. Her father had turned his back, his shoulders rigid with the burden of tradition that demanded he choose his tribe over his child. The Apache way was clear. To look upon a white man with anything other than suspicion was to betray generations of blood spilled on this very ground. Her people had fought the cavalry, the settlers, the miners who carved up their sacred mountains in search of silver and gold. They had watched their children taken to distant schools where Apache tongues were silenced and Apache hearts were taught to beat to foreign rhythms. To show interest in the enemy was to spit upon the graves of warriors who had died defending their homeland. But Ayanna remembered the moment differently than her accusers described. She had not seen an enemy in those blue eyes, but something that spoke to a loneliness she recognized in herself. The white man had been young, perhaps 20 summers, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work, and a face unmarked by the cruelty she had learned to expect from his kind. When their eyes met across the dusty trading post, she had seen not conquest or contempt, but a quiet sadness that mirrored her own. The sun climbed higher as she walked, her water nearly gone, her lips cracking like the desert floor beneath her feet. Buzzards circled overhead, patient as death itself. She had been walking toward the white settlements, though she could not say why. Perhaps because there was nowhere else to go. The other Apache bands would not take her in. Word of her exile would travel faster than her feet could carry her. The Mexican villages to the south held their own dangers for a lone Apache woman. Only the white settlements offered the possibility of survival, though she knew she would find little welcome there either. As the day wore on, her steps grew heavier, her vision blurring from heat and exhaustion. The landscape shimmered like water, playing tricks on her eyes. She began to see things that were not there: her grandmother's face in the clouds, her childhood home in the wavering air. The voices of her ancestors seemed to whisper on the wind, some condemning her choice, others mourning her fate. By evening she could walk no further, She collapsed beside a dry creek bed, her body finally surrendering to the punishment she had endured. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant as the eyes of the elders who had cast her out. She closed her eyes and prepared to join her ancestors, wondering if they would welcome her in the spirit world or turn their backs as her earthly family had done. It was then that she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the darkness, and her story took a turn that neither she nor her people could have foreseen. The rider who found her was not what Ayanna expected when she opened her eyes to see a figure silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Thomas McKenna was a man carved by the same harsh elements that had nearly claimed her life, his face weathered by 35 years of frontier living and marked by a grief that ran deeper than the arroyos that scarred the desert floor. He had been returning from town when his horse shied at something in the darkness, and his lantern revealed the collapsed form of the Apache woman. Most men in his position would have ridden on, leaving the Indian to whatever fate the desert had planned. The Apache and the white settlers existed in an uneasy truce at best, and a lone Apache woman could mean trouble, a trap, a test, or simply a problem he didn't need. But Thomas McKenna was not most men. 3 years earlier he had buried his wife Sarah and their infant son, victims of the fever that swept through the territory like wildfire. Since then, he had lived alone on his small ranch, tending his cattle and his sorrow with equal dedication. Something in the woman's face, peaceful despite her obvious suffering, reminded him of Sarah in her final moments. Without hesitation, he dismounted and knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but persistent. He lifted her carefully onto his horse, noting how light she was, how the desert had already begun to claim her. The ride back to his ranch took an hour, during which Ayanna drifted in and out of consciousness. She was aware of strong arms holding her steady, of the rhythmic gait of the horse beneath them, of a voice speaking softly in words she didn't understand but whose tone conveyed kindness rather than threat. When she tried to speak, to ask where he was taking her, only a whisper emerged from her parched throat. Thomas's ranch was modest, a small adobe house, a barn, corrals for his cattle, and a well that had never run dry in all his years there. He carried Ayanna inside and laid her on the bed he had once shared with his wife, then set about the business of saving her life. He brought water, feeding it to her drop by drop until her body remembered how to swallow. He prepared a simple broth from beef and vegetables, spooning it between her lips with the patience of a man who understood that healing could not be rushed. For 3 days, Ayanna hovered between life and death, while Thomas tended to her with the dedication of a man who had already lost too much to let death claim another soul in his presence. He bathed her fevered brow with cool water, changed her clothes when the fever broke and left her soaked in sweat, and sat beside her bed reading aloud from the only book he owned, a worn copy of the Bible that had belonged to his mother. On the 4th morning, Ayanna opened her eyes fully for the first time and found herself looking into the same blue eyes that had caused her exile. But now, instead of the brief moment of connection they had shared at the trading post, she saw something deeper, a kindness that asked for nothing in return, a gentleness that seemed impossible in a world that had shown her only harshness. "You're safe," Thomas said in halting Spanish, one of the few phrases he had learned from the Mexican vaqueros who sometimes worked his cattle. "No harm will come to you here." Ayanna understood enough to nod, though she wondered if safety was something she would ever truly know again. She was a woman without a people, without a place in the world, dependent on the mercy of a man whose very existence had cost her everything she had ever known. Yet as she looked around the simple room with its rough-hewn furniture and the wild flowers Thomas had placed in a jar by her bedside, she felt something she had not expected: hope. Over the following weeks, as her strength returned, Ayanna began to understand the man who had saved her. Thomas was a rancher of modest means, working a spread that provided enough to live on but little more. He had come west after the war, seeking a new start in a land that promised opportunity to those brave enough to claim it. He had found love with Sarah, a schoolteacher from back east who had followed him into the wilderness with nothing but faith in their future together. Their happiness had been brief but profound. Sarah had transformed the rough bachelor quarters into a home, planting a garden that bloomed despite the harsh climate and filling the house with laughter and music. When she became pregnant, Thomas had built a cradle with his own hands, carving it from oak and sanding it smooth as silk. But the fever had taken both mother and child within a week, leaving Thomas alone with his grief and his memories. Ayanna learned these things not through words, their shared vocabulary was limited, but through observation and the gradual understanding that comes when two wounded souls recognize each other. She saw how Thomas's eyes lingered on the cradle he had never had the heart to put away, how he still sat 2 places at the table before catching himself, how he spoke to his horse and his cattle with the gentleness of a man who had learned to find companionship wherever he could. In return, she began to share her own story through gestures and the few English words she picked up from listening to him. She showed him the traditional patterns her grandmother had taught her to weave, using scraps of cloth she found around the house. She prepared meals using the wild plants she gathered from around the ranch, adding flavors to his simple fare that reminded him there was still beauty to be found in the world. Slowly, carefully, they built a language of their own, part English, part Spanish, part Apache, and mostly the universal tongue of 2 people learning to trust again. Thomas taught her to read from his Bible, pointing to words and speaking them slowly until she could follow along. Ayanna taught him the names of plants and animals in her language, sharing the knowledge her people had accumulated over generations of living in harmony with the desert. The neighbors, when they noticed the Apache woman living at the McKenna Ranch, reacted with suspicion and hostility. Some demanded that Thomas turn her over to the authorities, claiming that harboring an Indian was dangerous and possibly illegal. Others simply shunned him, crossing the street when they saw him in town and refusing to do business with a man who had gone native. But Thomas had found something in Ayana's presence that he had thought lost forever, a reason to hope for tomorrow. She brought life back to his house and purpose back to his days. When she smiled, a rare occurrence at first but growing more frequent as the weeks passed, it was like watching the sun rise after a long, cold night. As autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the fragile peace that Thomas and Ayana had built together faced its first serious test. Word had reached the Apache reservation that one of their exiled daughters was living among the whites, and a delegation of warriors arrived at the ranch demanding her return. They came not out of love or forgiveness, but because her presence among their enemies was seen as a continuing insult to tribal honor. The leader of the group was Ayana's own brother, Nalnish, whose name meant he is strong, and whose reputation as a warrior was known throughout the territory. He had painted his face for war and carried the lance that had belonged to their father, its eagle feathers stirring in the desert wind like the ghosts of battles past. Behind him rode 6 other warriors, each one a veteran of the conflicts that had raged across Apache lands for decades. Thomas met them in his yard, unarmed but unafraid, while Ayana watched from the doorway of the house. The conversation that followed was conducted in a mixture of Apache, Spanish, and English, with gestures filling the gaps where words failed. Nalnish spoke with the authority of tradition and the pain of a brother who felt betrayed by his sister's choices. "She is dead to us," he declared, his voice carrying across the desert like the cry of a hunting hawk. "But her body walks among our enemies, bringing shame to our ancestors. This cannot continue." Thomas listened carefully, understanding more than he let on. He had spent months learning Apache words from Ayana, and while he could not speak the language fluently, he grasped the essence of what was being said. When Nalnish finished speaking, Thomas stepped forward, his own voice steady despite the tension that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. "She is under my protection," he said in Spanish, knowing that Nalnish would understand. "She has done no harm to your people or mine. She asks only for the chance to live in peace." Nalnish's eyes flashed with anger and something deeper, the pain of a man who had lost his sister not to death, which he could have honored, but to a choice he could not comprehend. "Peace?" he spat. "There is no peace between our peoples. There is only war, and those who forget this truth bring destruction upon all they touch." The standoff continued for what felt like hours, with neither side willing to give ground. The warriors behind Nalnish grew restless, their horses stamping and snorting as if sensing the tension of their riders. Thomas remained calm, but Ayana could see the way his hand rested near the rifle that leaned against the porch post, ready to defend her even against impossible odds. It was Ayana herself who finally broke the deadlock. She stepped out of the house and walked slowly toward her brother, her head held high despite the fear that made her heart race like a rabbit fleeing from a coyote. When she spoke, it was in the Apache tongue, her words carrying the weight of finality. "I am already dead to you, my brother," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You cannot kill what does not exist. I have made my choice, and I will live with the consequences. But I will not return to a people who have no place for me." Nalnish stared at his sister for a long moment, seeing in her face the stubborn determination that had marked her even as a child. She had always been different, always asking questions that had no easy answers, always looking beyond the boundaries that defined their world. Perhaps, he thought, this outcome had been inevitable from the moment she drew her first breath. "Then you are truly dead to us," he said finally, his voice heavy with grief. "And we will mourn you as we would mourn any warrior who falls in battle." With that, he wheeled his horse around and led his warriors away, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo across the desert like the last note of a funeral song. Ayana watched them go until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned to find Thomas standing beside her, his presence a solid anchor in a world that had suddenly become even more uncertain. That night, as they sat by the fire that Thomas had built in the yard, Ayana spoke of her childhood, of the stories her grandmother had told about the time before the white men came, when the Apache roamed freely across lands that stretched beyond the horizon. She spoke of the prophecies that foretold the coming of strangers from across the great water, and of the choices that each generation would have to make between the old ways and the new. "My grandmother said that some would choose to fight until the last breath left their bodies," Ayana said, her voice soft in the firelight. "Others would choose to adapt. to find new ways to survive in a changed world. She said that both choices required courage, but that history would judge which was wiser. Thomas listened without speaking, understanding that she was not just telling him stories but trying to make sense of her own choices and their consequences. When she finished, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, the wedding ring that had belonged to his wife Sarah. He had carried it with him every day since her death, unable to wear it, but unwilling to put it away. "Sarah would have liked you," he said, holding the ring up so that it caught the firelight. She believed that love was stronger than fear, that kindness could bridge any divide. She would have said that what we have found together is worth fighting for. He held out the ring to Ayanna, not as a proposal in the traditional sense, but as a symbol of the bond they had forged in the crucible of their shared exile. "Will you stay?" he asked simply. "Will you help me build something new here? Something that belongs to neither your world nor mine, but to us alone?" Ayanna looked at the ring, seeing in its simple gold band all the complexity of the choice before her. To accept it would be to turn her back forever on any hope of reconciliation with her people. To refuse it would be to remain forever suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. She thought of her grandmother's words about courage and adaptation, about the choices that each generation must make. She thought of the kindness Thomas had shown her when she had nothing left to offer in return, and of the peace she had found in his simple house on the edge of nowhere. Slowly, she extended her hand, and Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger. It was too large, meant for a different woman's hand, but it felt right somehow, a symbol of the imperfect but genuine love they had discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. The winter that followed was the harshest anyone in the territory could remember, with blizzards that buried the desert under blankets of snow and temperatures that froze the water in the wells solid as stone. But inside the McKenna ranch house, Thomas and Ayanna created a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire that burned constantly in the hearth, and everything to do with the life they were building together. Ayanna proved to be a natural rancher, her Apache upbringing having taught her to read the signs of weather and animal behavior with an accuracy that amazed Thomas. She could predict storms hours before they arrived, knew which cattle were likely to sicken before they showed symptoms, and had an intuitive understanding of the land that came from generations of ancestors who had lived in harmony with the desert's rhythms. Together they weathered not only the brutal winter, but also the continuing hostility of their neighbors. The town of Cedar Falls, 20 miles to the east, had made it clear that Thomas and his squaw wife were not welcome in their establishments. The general store refused to sell them supplies. The saloon turned them away at the door, and the church congregation made their disapproval known through cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when the couple appeared. But Thomas had learned to be self-sufficient during his years of solitary ranching, and Ayanna's knowledge of traditional Apache survival skills filled in the gaps that civilization had left behind. She showed him how to make soap from yucca roots, how to preserve meat using methods her people had perfected over centuries, and how to find medicinal plants that could treat everything from fever to infected wounds. More importantly, she taught him how to hope again. The house that had been a shrine to grief and lost dreams gradually transformed into a home filled with laughter and purpose. Ayanna sang while she worked, Apache songs that her grandmother had taught her, their haunting melodies echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. Thomas found himself humming along, creating a harmony that bridged the gap between their two cultures. In the spring, when the desert bloomed with wildflowers and the cattle grew fat on new grass, they received an unexpected visitor. Father Miguel Santos, the elderly priest who served the scattered Catholic communities throughout the territory, arrived at their door with a proposal that would change everything. Father Santos was a man who had spent 40 years ministering to the spiritual needs of people who lived on the margins of civilization. He had married Mexican vaqueros to Irish immigrant women, baptized the children of former slaves who had fled to the frontier seeking freedom, and performed last rites for Apache warriors who had converted to Christianity in their final moments. He understood better than most that love recognized no boundaries of race or creed. "I have heard about your situation," he told Thomas and Ayanna as they sat around their kitchen table sharing a simple meal. "The people in town speak of scandal and impropriety, but I see something different when I look at you both. I see two souls who have found peace in each other's company, and that is a blessing that should be celebrated, not condemned." He had come, he explained, to offer them the sacrament of marriage according to the rites of the Catholic Church. It would not change their legal status, Territorial law still prohibited marriage between whites and Indians, but it would provide them with the spiritual blessing that their union deserved and the moral authority to face down their critics. The ceremony took place the following Sunday at dawn, with only the desert wind and the morning stars as witnesses. Father Santos spoke the ancient words in Latin, then repeated them in Spanish and English, so that both bride and groom could understand the vows they were making. Ayanna wore a simple white dress that had belonged to Sarah McKenna, altered to fit her smaller frame, while Thomas stood beside her in his best suit, the same one he had worn to bury his first wife. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife in the eyes of God, Thomas kissed his bride as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless their union. It was a moment of perfect peace in a world that had shown them little kindness, a declaration that love could indeed triumph over prejudice and fear, but their happiness was destined to be tested once more, and in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. 3 days after their wedding, a rider arrived at the ranch with news that would force them to confront the consequences of their choices in the most dramatic way possible. The rider was Billy Hutchins, a young cowboy who worked for the neighboring Rocking H Ranch, and his face was pale with exhaustion and fear. He had ridden hard through the night to bring word that a band of Apache raiders had attacked a wagon train 50 miles to the south, killing 6 people and taking 2 women captive. The territorial governor had declared martial law and ordered all Apache individuals to report to the reservation immediately, or face arrest as enemy combatants. "They're saying your wife might be in contact with the raiders," Billy told Thomas, his voice shaking with the effort of delivering such dangerous news. "Sheriff Morrison is riding out here tomorrow with a posse to take her in for questioning. I thought you should know." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the implications of what Billy was telling him. In the hysteria that always followed Apache raids, reason gave way to fear, and fear demanded scapegoats. Ayanna, as the only Apache woman living openly among the white settlers, would be an obvious target for suspicion and blame. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind howl across the desert, Thomas and Ayanna faced the hardest decision of their lives. They could stay and fight the accusations, trusting in the truth of Ayanna's innocence and the justice of the territorial courts. Or they could flee, abandoning everything they had built together, but preserving their freedom and their lives. "Where would we go?" Ayanna asked, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "California," Thomas replied without hesitation. "I have a cousin in Los Angeles who owns a freight business. He's always said there's work for anyone willing to put in an honest day's labor. We could start over there where nobody knows our story." Ayanna was quiet for a long time, and Thomas could feel the weight of her thoughts in the silence between them. Finally she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears he could hear in her words. "I have been exiled once already," she said. "I will not be exiled again. This is our home, Thomas. This is where we made our vows, and where we chose to build our life together. If we run now, we will spend the rest of our days running, always looking over our shoulders, always afraid of the next accusation." Thomas knew she was right, but he also knew what they would be facing if they stayed. Sheriff Morrison was not a bad man, but he was a politician first and a lawman second, and he would do whatever was necessary to maintain order in his territory. If that meant arresting an innocent Apache woman to appease the fears of his white constituents, he would do it without hesitation. "Then we make our stand here," Thomas said finally, pulling his wife closer to him in the darkness. "Whatever comes, we face it together." As dawn broke over the desert, they prepared for the confrontation that would determine not only their fate, but the legacy of the love they had dared to build, in defiance of a world that said it could not exist. Sheriff Morrison arrived at noon with a posse of 12 men, their faces grim with the weight of duty and the fear that had gripped the territory since news of the Apache raid spread like wildfire through the settlements. Thomas met them in the yard, standing tall and calm despite the rifles that pointed in his direction, while Ayanna remained in the doorway of the house, her presence a silent testament to her refusal to hide from the accusations that had brought these men to their home. Morrison was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of frontier law enforcement and burdened by the impossible task of maintaining peace between peoples who seemed destined for eternal conflict. He had known Thomas McKenna for 3 years, had shared drinks with him in town before the rancher's controversial marriage, and had always found him to be an honest and reliable man. But politics and public safety sometimes demanded actions that personal feelings would reject. "Thomas," the sheriff said, dismounting from his horse and approaching with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. "I'm sorry to have to do this, but I need to ask your wife some questions about the raid on the Pemberton wagon train. There are folks saying she might have information that could help us track down the raiders." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the posse and his wife, his voice steady, but edged with steel. "Ayanna hasn't left this ranch in 3 months, Sheriff. She's been here with me every day, working the cattle and tending the house. She has no contact with any Apache bands, and she certainly has no knowledge of any raids." "I believe you, Thomas," Morrison replied, and the sincerity in his voice was evident to everyone present. "But believing and proving are two different things in the eyes of the law. There are witnesses who claim they saw smoke signals coming from this direction the day before the raid. There are people saying your wife has been sending messages to her people, coordinating attacks on white settlements." Ayanna stepped forward then, her head held high and her voice clear as she spoke in English that had improved dramatically during her months with Thomas. "I am here, Sheriff Morrison. You may ask me your questions. I have nothing to hide and nothing to fear from the truth." The sheriff looked at her with something approaching respect, recognizing the courage it took for an Apache woman to face down a posse of armed white men in a territory where her people were considered enemies of the state. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, using her married name deliberately, "can you account for your whereabouts on the day of the Pemberton raid?" "I was here," Ayanna replied simply. "I was helping my husband repair the fence in the north pasture. We worked from sunrise to sunset, and he can tell you every moment of that day." "And you've had no contact with any Apache bands since you came to live here?" "None," she said firmly. "My people have cast me out. I am dead to them as they are to me. I have no way to send messages even if I wish to do so." One of the posse members, a hot-headed young rancher named Jake Brennan, whose father had been killed in an Apache raid 5 years earlier, spurred his horse forward and pointed an accusing finger at Ayanna. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "They all lie. How do we know she's not a spy, sent here to watch our movements and report back to the war parties?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Thomas felt his temper flare despite his efforts to remain calm. "Jake Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced down Apache warriors and lived to tell about it, "you're talking about my wife, and I'll thank you to show her the respect she deserves. She's done nothing but work hard and live peacefully since she came here." "Peaceful?" Brennan laughed bitterly. "Tell that to the Pemberton children who watched their parents get scalped. Tell that to the women who were dragged off to God knows what fate." Sheriff Morrison raised his hand for silence, recognizing that the situation was rapidly spiraling toward violence. He had seen too many lynch mobs in his years as a lawman to miss the signs of one forming before his eyes. "That's enough, Jake," he said firmly. "We're here to ask questions, not to hold a trial in the middle of someone's yard." But the damage was done. The other members of the posse were nodding in agreement with Brennan's words, their faces hardening with the certainty that comes when fear finds a target for its rage. Thomas could see the situation deteriorating, and knew that words alone would not be enough to protect his wife from the mob mentality that was taking hold. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the tension like a knife through leather. "The woman speaks the truth," said a figure emerging from behind the barn, and every man in the posse turned to see who had spoken. What they saw defied all their expectations and changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The speaker was an elderly Apache man, his long gray hair braided with eagle feathers and his face marked by the ritual scars of a medicine man. He walked with the dignity of age and wisdom, his presence commanding respect even from those who considered him an enemy. Behind him walked 2 younger Apache men, both carrying rifles but holding them in a non-threatening manner. "Grandfather," Ayanna whispered, using the Apache word for a respected elder. Though this man was not related to her by blood, she recognized him as Geronimo's own medicine man, a figure of legendary status among her people, and one of the most wanted men in the territory. The old man approached the group slowly, his eyes fixed on Sheriff Morrison with the steady gaze of someone who had faced death many times and no longer feared it. When he spoke, it was in English, heavily accented but perfectly clear, learned during his years of negotiating with white officials and military commanders. "I am called Naiche by my people," he said, using the Apache pronunciation of his name. "You know me as the medicine man of Geronimo's band. I have come here to speak for this woman, who is my granddaughter in spirit if not in blood." The posse members shifted nervously in their saddles. unsure whether they were facing a peaceful delegation or walking into an ambush. Sheriff Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but he made no aggressive moves, recognizing that any violence could trigger a bloodbath that would leave none of them alive. "I know who you are," Morrison said carefully. "There's a price on your head, old man. What are you doing here?" Nietzsche smiled, an expression that held no warmth but carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "I am here to tell you that this woman had no part in the raid you speak of. She is dead to us, as she has told you. We do not speak to the dead, and the dead do not carry messages for the living." "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Jake Brennan demanded, his voice shrill with fear and anger. "How do we know this isn't all part of some Apache trick?" The old medicine man turned his gaze on Brennan, and the young rancher felt his courage wither under that ancient stare. "Because," Nietzsche said simply, "if we wanted to kill you, you would already be dead. Look around you, young fool. Do you see only 3 Apache here?" As if summoned by his words, figures began to emerge from concealment all around the ranch. Apache warriors who had been invisible moments before, positioned with the skill that had made them the most feared fighters in the Southwest. They appeared from behind rocks, from shallow depressions in the earth, from places where no cover seemed to exist. Within seconds, the posse found themselves surrounded by more than 20 Apache fighters, all armed and all capable of ending the confrontation in a matter of heartbeats. But instead of attacking, the warriors simply stood in place, their presence a demonstration of power rather than a threat of violence. Nietzsche raised his hand, and they melted back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared, leaving only the medicine man and his 2 companions visible. "We came here to speak truth," Nietzsche continued, his voice carrying across the desert like the whisper of wind through canyon walls. "This woman chose her path when she looked with favor upon a white man. She is no longer Apache in the eyes of our people. She cannot help you find the raiders because she does not know where they are. She cannot carry messages to us because we do not listen to her voice. She is what you whites call a ghost, visible but not real, present but not alive." Sheriff Morrison felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He was a practical man who understood that sometimes the truth came from unexpected sources, and he could see the sincerity in the old Apache's words. More importantly, he understood that he and his men had just been given a demonstration of Apache power that should have terrified them, but instead carried a message of restraint. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. "Why risk capture to defend a woman your people have cast out?" Nietzsche was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the sheriff to Ayanna, and then to Thomas, seeing in their faces the love that had defied every convention of their respective worlds. When he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that seemed to encompass all the losses his people had endured. "Because," he said finally, "there has been enough death between our peoples. Because this woman and this man have found something that our wars have not been able to destroy. Because sometimes, even an old warrior must choose peace over vengeance." He turned to Ayanna then, speaking to her in rapid Apache, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and blessing. She listened with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she was receiving something she had never expected, forgiveness from the people who had cast her out. When he finished speaking, Nietzsche nodded to Sheriff Morrison one final time. "You will find your raiders to the south near the Mexican border," he said. "They are not from our band, but from the Chiricahua who follow Victorio. They took your women to trade for weapons and ammunition. If you ride hard, you may reach them before they cross into Mexico." With that, he turned and walked away, his 2 companions flanking him as they disappeared into the desert as silently as they had come. The posse sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed and what it meant for their mission. Sheriff Morrison was the first to speak, his voice heavy with the weight of decision. "Well, boys," he said, holstering his weapon and preparing to mount his horse, "I reckon we've got our answer. Mrs. McKenna is innocent of any wrongdoing, and we've got raiders to catch before they reach the border." As the posse rode away, leaving Thomas and Ayanna alone in their yard, the couple stood together in the afternoon sun, holding each other close and marveling at the unexpected turn their story had taken. They had been prepared to face persecution and possibly death, but instead they had received something far more precious, the blessing of both their peoples and the freedom to live their love without fear. The desert wind carried the sound of hoofbeats into the distance, and with it the last echoes of the conflict that had threatened to destroy everything they had built together. In its place came a silence that spoke of peace, of acceptance, and of the possibility that love could indeed triumph over the hatred that had divided their worlds for so long.